Hi, my name's Phil. I like to talk about politics, and in this video, I'd like to discuss the latest Brexit trade barrier coming online this week, which will hit more small businesses, preventing them from exporting to the EU. It's the EU regulation on general product safety. So what is it? Why is it coming into law now? How exactly is it going to affect British businesses? But first, for daily political commentary, please hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out. So I've been trying to explain for some years that Brexit isn't something that happened on a particular day. Nigel Farage last week tried to claim that Brexit is something that happened 8 years ago. We should all shut up about it with the referendum, you know. Even he doesn't believe that because he claims that what happened since is not what he intended. Also, I'm just going to point this out. Nigel Farage going, oh, why do you keep going on about it? Already Brexit supporters says, why do you keep going on about it? Says, you should ask them, why aren't you going on about it more? You said it would be this brilliant thing. You're supposed to be proud of it. It's your, Nigel Farage arguably is one of the most impactful politicians of the last 10 years, specifically because of Brexit. Why doesn't he want to talk about it? But anyway, it's how he dodges responsibility for the disaster that unfolded by saying, oh, it happened in the past, forget about it. But no, it didn't. Brexit isn't something that happened 8 years ago. It's not something that happened even when we left the EU. It's at the end of January 2020, or even when we left the single market and customs union at the end of December 2020. Brexit was deliberately chunked by the Tories to keep parcelling out more and more trade barriers over a series of years rather than all at once in order to affect this sort of frog in the boiling pot acceptance by the public. But another huge aspect of Brexit, which the Tories failed to grasp, would be the sort of divergence which didn't happen deliberately, but as a consequence of the EU passing new laws, which, just like an individual country, does all the time. The latest is the RGPS, and I guess you can probably blame China for it a little bit if you like. The EU, of course, famously has the highest product standards in the world. But as I often say, a rule that is not enforced is not a rule at all. And it seems there was a massive hole in enforcement through which products sent by companies like Temu and Amazon, they allow you to buy products from around the world. And, especially we're thinking like in China, where the state subsidizes the cost of transport, making it much cheaper. So it's viable to buy, quite small things from China. But those countries do not have the same production standards. Now, what should really happen is that any product ordered from China, for example, there should be some system that says if you're importing it into, say, an EU country, oh, this doesn't meet the EU standards, you can't order it. It's like, but who does that? Who checks? As far as the companies in China is concerned, it's like, no, these are the products we sell. Do you want one of them? We'll send it to you. They're not going to check which of their goods meets the standards of a completely different market. So what's been happening is that people have just been ordering things from, like, Temu, for example, importing them into whichever EU country. There's no actual checking that the product's legal, which means loads of goods have been sold into the EU directly to individual domestic customers illegally. So this new EU law, which applies to non-food products, means that businesses have to have like a designated officer to ensure compliance with EU standards. They've got to publish information about their procedures, and they've got to have some mechanism for dealing with traders who keep offering illegal products to customers in the EU. And all of this means yet another administrative cost for businesses wanting to export to the EU single market. Something which large businesses who sell goods by the shipload can meet, but small businesses get clobbered yet again. And I'll just point out, this is going to keep happening. The EU drives up standards all the time, which means it will also have to tighten enforcement all the time as other markets fail to keep up. And it's inevitably going to hit Britain very hard because, along with Trump's America, we're the only country in the world that has actively tried to make trade with our closest and most important market more difficult. And you may be thinking, well, okay, sure. We know that China doesn't have the best product safety standards in the world, but we're pretty good in the UK. Couldn't we get some sort of exemption from this? It's like, well, in theory, but we'd have had to have negotiated that with the EU, and it would have required dynamic alignment of standards across all the affected products. So for several reasons, the Tories obviously made no attempt to do so. As Labour push for their agreement on SPS checks, which will also require some form of dynamic alignment and role for the ECJ, it's possible we could incorporate an agreement for GPSR as well. But this is going to be, that's going to take a couple of years at least. The new law comes into effect this Friday. And the reality is it's much like the health certificate problem for animal and plant products. So I remind you of the case of the Cheshire Cheese Company, who were very open about the fact they had to stop exporting to EU customers overnight because the cost of the paperwork, the health certificate, was more than the value of the consignment. Well, for small businesses selling individual products to customers in the EU, same sort of thing applies. This is literally going to stop some small businesses in the UK exporting to EU customers overnight and just before Christmas. Also especially tough on small businesses, not just because of the quantities they sell, so, economies of scale work against them. But a large business, like a very large business, can afford to hire someone or maybe a whole team to keep up to date with EU rules and work on systems to manage them in plenty of time. A small business can't do that. So the owner has to do it all themselves. And one thing I and others kept saying is that there was no EU red tape. They talked about EU red tape. No such thing. The EU exists to remove red tape. Any admin that any business had to complete inside the single market was the sort of admin you'd have to do outside it as well. But there was a whole heap of export paperwork you just didn't need as EU members, which we do now. Membership of the EU literally meant that you could export to most of Europe without ever having to know the first thing about exporting, because it's like you weren't exporting. Like I kept saying, if you were in Britain, you could send a product to Bruges as easily as Birmingham. What small business owners have had to learn in a really short space of time with almost no help from the government is basically, how do you trade internationally? Because they didn't have to know anything about it, and it's complex. Needless to say, this is not something which would affect those businesses if we were still inside at least the single market. That's because they'd have a legal duty to be compliant with EU standards, and so no further checks or admin would be required when selling around the single market. But there's another problem, at least some businesses might have about this as well: information. So I had a small business owner email me about concerns that the government wasn't really providing any information on what's needed to really deal with this. And my response is, I suspect this is deliberate on the part of the Conservatives. Like, they spent years refusing to acknowledge that any problems would be caused by Brexit at all. Theresa May, remember, was forced to publish Operation Yellowhammer, which was a document setting out, what would be the problems with Brexit. She was forced to publish it by MPs because she didn't want to do so herself. Even when we left the single market and it was all too late, Boris Johnson's government obviously decided not to draw attention to problems. See, for them, they would rather businesses suffer than that they publish information that highlighted the extra problems caused by Brexit that they said wouldn't exist. And the regime we have in place now for informing British businesses about changes to the systems in our most important export market was set up by the Conservatives. Mind you, it would probably do no harm if anyone is concerned and you have a Labour MP to write to them and ask what's been done to improve those systems for helping keep businesses informed about new trade barriers like this in advance. My guess would be not a lot, because I think, given that Labour are hoping to come to an agreement with the EU on trade anyway, which will involve dynamic alignment of standards, I strongly suspect they're not going to consider it a priority to work in parallel on improved systems to warn businesses about problems, which they will hope will go away in a few years. Now, that's just speculation on my part. I don't know. But I wouldn't say I'd have any confidence that the government will give enough help or warning to small businesses about new trade barriers coming online in the future unless they're prompted to do so. So yeah, another Brexit hit coming this week. We've been outside the EU for almost 5 years, outside the single market and customs union for almost 4 years. And yet we're still getting new Brexit trade barriers being raised against us all the time. And it will never stop until Brexit stops. Brexit isn't something that happened 8 years ago or 5 years ago or even 4 years ago. It's something which is happening this week, and there's more Brexit happening next year as well. And that's just what I know about. There will also be more Brexit happening the year after and the year after that. And the only way to make it all stop is to do what almost all other countries do. Agree easier trade with those whom we trade the most with. Fortunately, the EU have a really good system. It's unique in the world, in fact. If you join it, you have completely free trade within it. Even the United States doesn't have free trade inside its own market. Only the EU has that. And we chose to leave it. And the most maddening thing of all is that it's supposedly free market advocates who persuaded us to leave the only genuinely free market in the world. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, please click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, you can join for memberships. Thanks for watching. Until next time, I'll see you later.